Thank you, Paul. Um, and it does look like we have somebody just going to admit into the room. Welcome to whoever I just admitted. And like I said, thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me to speak. And thank you to everybody who showed up today to attend. Um, I'm honored to be able to share a little bit about my experience working in addiction treatment, as well as my understanding and my experience with acceptance commitment therapy. And I'm particularly grateful to be able to speak here in at the New Canaan Parent Support Group. Um, as Paul mentioned, I currently live in Stamford, but I also am a product of Fairfield County. I grew up here, um, and I know intimately what it's like um, to grow up here. I witnessed, what it's like to have experienced pain here. Um, I've seen the way in which people have struggled, um, families, peers, loved ones, and I've also seen the way in which people recover here. And I am particularly grateful. I think New Canaan has done a wonderful job at recovering out loud, so to speak, and creating spaces where people can actually talk about very difficult topics, coupled with the fact that it is unbelievably challenging to navigate resources when you're in the position of being a loved one for your child, and really understanding what do various interventions mean, what are levels of care, how to best advocate for the needs of your child and how to best provide them the appropriate resources while also taking care of yourself and rediscovering what does it mean to be a parent in this kind of crisis, and what does it mean, and how do I find the tools to be able to have agency in how I show up. And a lot of those concepts that I'm talking about are concepts that acceptance commitment therapy seeks to address and provide tools for. So as Paul mentioned, I have, I'm currently working in private practice, and I have a group practice called Connected Therapy Group. But previous to moving back to Connecticut and starting this private practice, and I have spent roughly the last 10 years working within treatment settings. And I've also taught at NYU. And so I have experience both acting as a clinician as well as developing programs in detox, inpatient, IOP, OP, so the whole spectrum. Um, and along the way, I'm really driven by a mission to advocate for top-down and bottom-up approaches to be utilized in the treatment of individuals with substance use disorders alongside community and social supports. I also will find that this top-down, bottom-up approach isn't as useful not just for individual with substance use disorders, but really any individual who is um, struggling as a result of some disconnection or avoidance of themselves or the people around them. Um, and so after years of work and being trained in various different modalities, um, and by the way, when I say top down or bottom up approaches, what I'm really talking about are sort of body-based interventions and then cognitive-based interventions. That's usually what people are referring to. The mind, the body, cognitive behavioral therapies, somatic, body-based embodiment approaches. And so after years of work in various modalities, and also just personal experience of being in the pursuit of freedom and flexibility, I have come to learn that growth and recovery isn't about the reduction of symptoms, and that the solution isn't about changing your thoughts or changing your emotions or changing your behaviors. That the solution and the freedom and the flexibility actually arises from changing our relationship to our thoughts and feelings, and then making the choice to follow that up with committed action that aligns with a meaningful life, right? And that was a huge pivot in my career as well. And so part of this lecture today and ACT is really talking about how do we get out of our own way and empower ourselves. And that's sort of the foundation of what I see ACT providing, right? Um, and to sort of step out of this struggle with self that so many of us find ourselves in. Um, so my hope for the portion where I'm going to be talking is that I'm able to communicate a framework for recovery and reconnecting with yourself and answer the what and why acceptance commitment therapy for the treatment of substance use disorders. So, um, and with that, let's start with like, well, what is acceptance commitment therapy? And first and foremost, it is an evidence-based psychological intervention. And so evidence-based, what does that mean? It means it is a intervention that has been studied and researched and backed with backed with science and fine-tuned, and that the effectiveness of this intervention has been verified and researched. Um, and it was developed in the 1980s. Um, One of the major developers is a guy, Stephen Hayes. So there are a lot of people who have contributed to the development of this framework and the research and the body of research. And there is so much research that it can get really overwhelming, and I don't want to spend time going into that and the science behind it all, but just simply to say that it's one that has been found effective. Um, and it was started in the 80s, so we're talking about like 40 years of research. And it's part of people call it the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy. So um, it falls under it came out of a cognitive behavioral approach. Um, and, with all of psychological interventions or treatment modalities, there's sort of this um, constant preoccupation or discussion of like, well, what is self? And how can we adapt, like, how can we change or how can we elicit or create change? And CBT had the mindset of really let's look at our thoughts. Let's start changing our thoughts. Um, and that we can modulate our thoughts, which can help modulate our emotions and then our behaviors. And it's sort of this triangle approach of tweaking this and tweaking that. And ACT basically came in and was like, wait a second, maybe it's not about the thoughts at all. That the thoughts that we're having isn't what's important here and is just going to detract us from being able to connect with ourselves. Um, it's interesting. I was listening to Stephen Hayes, and he was sort of talking about how, like, what separates humans from animals is the fact that we're able to make meaning in associations, and that we are hardwired to constantly be making meaning and association and finding things in relationship to each other while we're awake, while we're asleep all the time. And so any attempt that's made to try to change how you're thinking, you're is not going to work because your brain is operating. That meaning making machine is happening even while you sleep. And so it's a really futile exercise. And very often, the more we try to engage in that level with ourselves, the more we amplify the things that cause us to feel stuck. The more we ultimately then also amplify the experience of pain and suffering that our meaning making machines were trying to get us to resolve to begin with, right? So, ACT is really bringing in this new wave of concept of self and work, and what at its foundation, if you were to consolidate everything that is ACT into one process, it's about psychological flexibility. And what is psychological flexibility, right? Psychological flexibility means that we have the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, that we're able to manage our thoughts, our emotions, and that we're able to pursue goals and the things that are valuable and meaningful to us despite the obstacles that we approach. Um, Put in other ways, it's like a growth mindset, right? It's a mindset where um, there are possibilities. We can think creatively. We have agency and freedom of choice of how we want to move forward, given any obstacle that we may face. And seeking psychological flexibility through the processes of ACT is it's really about being able to expand our capacity to be able to choose what's available in our contexts. On the flip side, inflexibility is seen as the root of human suffering, right? When we're cognitively inflexible, we're stuck. Even me saying it, I can like feel what that feels like, right? When you're just unable to move forward, that things are rigid, there are all these rules, you're limited. What's possible for you is so small, and your world becomes so small, and your bandwidth to tolerate anything becomes smaller and smaller. And so ACT, through extensive research, as we know they like to do, um, we're able to find six, or they sort of boiled things down to six foundational processes um, that aid in flexibility. And they have a little model called the Hexaflex model, which I am going to share with all of you guys now, um, if I can. Okay, I hope you guys got that. It's in the chat. It seems complicated. Um, there are six processes, uh, and we will go into all six processes. But in essence, a lot of these processes can also be lumped together into more like three um, segments, where the concept is about being in pursuit of being open, aware, and mindful, and then actively engaged in life. Um, and so, I mean, I guess I could just go over it really quickly. So the processes listed there, right? We have acceptance, diffusion, present moment awareness, self as context. All those processes, as we'll break it, we'll break them down, are really about cultivating a kind of attentional focus of yourself. And then the other processes of values and committed action, I guess I'm lumping them into two. Well, aware, right? Being aware of like, well, what are my values in this scenario, in this pain that I'm experiencing, in this crisis that I have now chosen to make myself aware of? How do I identify what values are important to me that can inform the actions that I want to take in this scenario? Um, and so, and again, we'll go into those items more, but it's really this attentional focus and then making the choice to move towards, by moving, I mean like our attention and also our behavior towards engaging with life in a meaningful way. And this is the point where we get to decide, right, what kind of person do I want to be? Yes, I am aware I have this pain. There's all this chaos happening. What's valuable for how I want to show up in this moment? What kind of qualities do I want to have be revealed in my life moments? And then how can I build habits around that that align with that? So, um, a big hang up when talking about acceptance commitment therapy is, what does this word acceptance mean? Um, I think it gets used a lot, especially in the recovery community. Um, and it can be often misused, um, where acceptance is not about tolerating or enduring pain. Um, Acceptance in this context is about choosing to acknowledge and to create space for your own experience, right? It's it means looking into that pain with a spirit of willingness, openness, embracing it. Um, it's a turning towards as opposed to away. And that is really, really, really hard to do, right? Because it's like also a fundamental human behavior to avoid pain, right? Whether it's external pain or internal pain. Um, but the problem is that we're very ineffective at our ability to actually effective, like in our ability to avoid. And there's very few things that we can do that actually allow us to avoid that pain. Um, Substance use is one of them. And guess what? It's like extremely effective, right? Um, so, so Stephen Hayes used to be a linguist, and he can do a much better definition or explanation of where the word acceptance comes from. But what I think is interesting about what he did, just to summarize his point, was that the word acceptance originally had meaning or was derived from the idea of receiving a gift, right? And when you give somebody a gift, right, you ask them, will they accept this gift? And so acceptance and usually one does so willingly, openly, with curiosity of like, what's in this gift? And so acceptance in this context within acceptance commitment therapy, again, it's not about just like stoically enduring the pain that comes our way, but having the choice to look at that pain, to create space internally, expand a little bit in our ability to hold it, and to become curious about what lies within that pain. What wisdom can we gain from that pain? Um, Yeah. So, like I mentioned, right? So then in this context, right, we can start looking at drug use as this desperate attempt to really not accept your life experiences. Um, but the truth is there's no such thing as a delete button to what has happened, nor is there really a delete button to what is currently happening. Um, those things will eventually need to be addressed, or you can just continue to avoid. Um, so that's a little bit about ACT. I think, in regards to like why ACT for substance use disorder. Well, one, I think inherently in the framework that I just explained, there's a clear overlap, but also there's research. It's an evidence-based modality, and it's been found to be very effective for individuals with substance use disorder. Particularly in the short term, they have found moderate uh, increased effectiveness to ACT over other evidence-based approaches. Um, at least in the 6-month period. At the 1-year mark, they tend to all have similar results, but in regards to like the amount of people that had sustained abstinence, um, it's been effective. It's also been there's been evidence to show it's very effective for young adults, um, which developmentally, right, young adulthood is the time period of a lot of meaning making, of making those choices of like, who am I? Who do I want to be? And what role do drugs and alcohol play in that life? Does it bring me closer or farther away? And so it's a really ripe time for that kind of reflective work. So that's why I'm not surprised that it was found to be effective for that population. Um, so why do people use drugs? Why do There's many theories. There's the self-medication hypothesis, right? That people are using to cope with pain. Um, you could break down just about any motivation that any reason somebody communicates as to why they use can be grounded in sort of 3 categories: self-medication, a desire to reduce negative thoughts and feelings, or because they want to amplify positive experiences. Um, but behind all of those motivations is an avoidance factor, right? So if you look at it, right, like at the client who believes that substances, or the loved one, or the kid who believes that substances help them. This was a classic one. And I think one that I see commonly around here is like, well, it elevates their performance, right? And in such a performance achievement-based society, that feels really important. But taking the drug is what allows them to not get in contact with that fear that they may not be able to perform. And what that also robs people of is the experience of actually being capable of coping, of performing, of achieving, right? They deny themselves the ability to prove themselves wrong. Right? The idea that like, oh, I use to like fit in or like to connect. What are they avoiding? Is it this avoiding social anxiety? Is it avoiding potential awkwardness? Again, all things that they rob themselves of the connection to that feeling, and they rob themselves of the ability to experience and proving themselves wrong. Um, And so with ACT and sort of this attentional focus, it's about beginning to welcome these emotions. It's about recognizing that like pain and discomfort is a part of life. Um, and right, and people who are resistant to do this, well, then you also have to ask them like, what do you lose by by seeking to avoid? What are the costs? And there's tremendous costs, far beyond just the substance use, right? Like I mentioned, right? The cost of denying yourself the possibility for things to be different than how you fear in that moment. And so for ACT, it's accepting that pain is a part of life and that recovery means living meaningfully despite the pain or with that pain, right? Having the willingness to embrace it, embracing that anxiety, embracing that um, potential awkwardness, embracing that sadness, so that you can then identify the value that's important to you within it and inform how you want to behave in the world. So again, the emphasis on with ACT then really becomes developing a value-based life. And that regarding substance use recovery, it's not about the stopping of the usage, but it's about building a life that's worth staying sober for. Um, right? Inflexibility, I'm just not going to use, and that's just the point. Flexibility is being able to expand into this meaningful, full life that is a reflection of your values and how you want to be, and acknowledging that in the pursuit of that, I will have to accept pain, discomfort, hard feelings. So, I just want to be mindful of time. So, in regards to the 6 processes, right, the hexaflex that I shared with you guys in the chat, um, I'm just okay. So, what are they? And the idea is like these are 6 processes. They're not in order. It's not like you have to do this and then this and then this. They don't build on each other. They work dynamically and are interwoven. And the belief is like sometimes when you tweak here, you get movement on the other point of the hexaflex. And that part of gaining flexibility is using these various tools. And there are times that one is more helpful than the other. Um, and sometimes like values can help us with the acceptance piece, and sometimes acceptance and diffusion can help us with committed action, right? They all work together. Um, and so acceptance, as I just mentioned, right, it's all about making room for hard feelings. I think I sort of spoke about that for a while. And then in regards, the next one is, oh, let's see what actually. Okay, acceptance, right? Choosing to embrace the internal experiences as opposed to trying to change them. The flip side of that, instead of choosing to accept, people engage in like experiential avoidance, right? Which is ineffective unless you use drugs. Then there's something called cognitive diffusion, right? And that's the practice of noticing thoughts as opposed to being stuck in them. Recognizing that thoughts are just mental events as opposed to reality. And also it's about cultivating, and other modalities we'll talk about, like that observing self, right? You become the self that notices these thoughts as opposed to becoming the thought itself. I'm going to skip to self as context. That's also what self of context is like. Very often when we're faced with crisis or struggle, there is a tendency to identify with just that one experience, and that becomes all that you are, right? Particularly, I see this with people with substance use disorder, right? They become the addict, and that's all that they are. And there's this fusion, this um, lack of perspective that who they are is far more than just the part of self that's currently using. Um, and so the importance of bringing into attention, right, that there's more to who you are than just this one part. Um, Present moment awareness, that's about the practice of staying grounded in the now, in the here and now, anchoring us in the present. You can do this in with many different ways, through meditation, through noticing, through um, seeing where you are and what's happening today, as opposed to what's happened in the past or what you fear may happen in the future. And then there's values, right? Identifying what matters most and using those values as a compass to help guide what direction you go in storms. Very often, I also know very often we can over-attach to outcomes or goals. Um, or I see this, sometimes also with parents. Where there's an attachment to a goal that they're striving towards, as opposed to a way of engaging in the relationship, right? So this is like asking questions of like, who do you want to be in this moment? I think, for parents in particular, it's like, well, what kind of mother do I want to be in this moment or in these moments? What are the values that help keep me grounded in what choices I make? And then finally, committed action. What small steps can I take right now that are in alignment with those values? Because, like, the values don't mean much if there isn't follow up with action. Um, so, I think so. In regards to some questions, right, as parents that we can sometimes ask ourselves to incorporate ACT would be things like, when my child struggles, what feelings come up for me? What do they look like? How can I create space for those feelings? How can I honor them and respect that they're very real? And then how can I notice what are the thoughts that then also come up that pull me away from being the parent I want to be in these moments? And I think in those two questions, right, those 6 processes or 5 processes get revealed. And then the final one being like, okay, well, what's one small action that I can do to honor the feelings that come up in me and the values that are most important to me? So I know I was supposed to give 30 minutes to the audience, but my hope is that one thing that you guys all take from what I've shared about today is just that our progress and our growth lies in how we relate to our thoughts and feelings. Um, and that ACT can be a tool for individuals to find autonomy and freedom within their internal and external worlds. And yeah, and thank you all for listening. And please, if you guys have any questions or feedback, or whether about ACT or just in general substance use disorders, let me know.
Well, can you just give get an, a kind of template of somebody comes in with a substance use disorder and you say, well, this is going to take, how many sessions,
Mm.
and what is the process you go through to apply ACT with this client over, say, it's 8 sessions or whatever?
Yeah, so the evidence-based interventions that have been researched and have clear outcomes, those are very um, time-based sessions. And what they found is the more ACT sessions you have, the better the outcomes. Of course. Um, so I would say for me personally, I don't apply such a rigid modality. I think it's also very hard to quantify how long it takes for individuals to start reconnecting with themselves.
Mhm.
So that's where and also the flexibility that one may experience ebbs and flows. And very often when people are either like newly sober, um, there's not a whole lot of flexibility. There is a good amount of rigidity, and some of that rigidity is also very protective. It can help people, right? And so we always want to be assessing for what is somebody's window of tolerance, and that's where I pull on my bottom-up trauma approaches of like what is somebody's window of tolerance to start embracing that turn inward.
Okay, can you give an average though, how many sessions this takes, or is it more a journey? You can't, you're not applying a rigid ACT approach during the sessions anyway. You're using the tools.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Um,
Looks like Susan has a question.
yeah, yeah.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for that. I
Hi.
was curious to learn more. My personal, much more familiarity with DBT and
Mhm.
CBT and other modes. So I was curious. I mean, a couple of things struck me when you talk about acceptance, and obviously radical acceptance is one of the pillars
Mhm.
of DBT. I think in some similar ways, but maybe some different ways. So I just wanted to get a little bit of your vantage about when one might be more appropriate than another, but also specifically, and just in the case of my loved one, adult son, with pretty significant mental illness, schizoaffective, and suicidality
Mhm.
and substance use, but the suicidality way preceded, from childhood, there were hospitalizations. I'm trying to suss out, and he says he's open to a therapist. He very much sort of wants to talk about his trauma. Um,
Mhm.
he's probably still not completely accepted. I'm wondering if two questions. ACT really is, I'm assuming, most effective for people who acknowledge the substance use disorder and that at least a piece of that is getting in their way, whether it's of a more meaningful life.
Mhm.
Um, can it work if the person's values on your, I love you, I
Mhm.
find the diagram very interesting. I'm
Mhm.
thinking of values and actions, and I know for somebody with sometimes delusional or irrational thoughts, that piece of it might not be doable. He also does have, I mean, like so many people, sort of a variety of diagnoses over the years, including uh, borderline personality, and that's why we've had much exposure to
DBT.
DBT, both at Silver Hill and McLean, and blah, 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 blah. But he's always sounding like he's open to something new, and he's very jaded about everything else. And
Mhm.
he says right now he can't find a therapist. And again, part of me is learning to detach with love and all of that. And I'm a member of NAMI, and I go to Al-Anon and try to be supportive. But he also sort of doesn't know what he doesn't know. And he's often very interested, at least initially, or open to something. And I was interested in what you were saying, Paul, not that there's any magic fix it. And he wouldn't believe that either. If you told him 6 sessions, 12 sessions, you're done. Because the DBT programs he's been in have been somewhat arguably time limited. Um, anyway, I just wondered if you could kind of compare and contrast uh, your expertise, maybe specifically with DBT, and then also address the population. How many of them also have co-occurring serious mental illness?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
specifically suicidality that just comes up again and again and again.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
I mean, and I Yes, and there's no question ACT, there's been a lot of research that supports that it's effective in addressing co-occurring mental health. And actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the researchers and founders who helped develop, like two major ones that I think of, who helped develop ACT, they themselves struggled. One was had severe panic disorder. That was Stephen Hayes. And then another guy was, for him, it was his suicidality and having really difficult time connecting with life. And that's where this building a meaningful life and the values-based work has been his experience. Really helpful and sort of the surrender. And it did, I mean, in his experience, he will say that it started with a moment of acceptance
It's
of, okay, I guess I will try this living thing. Um, or, for Stephen Hayes with the anxiety, he's like, all right, anxiety, like, kill me. If that's what you're trying to do, and it's this full embrace. There is that moment
mm,
of reckoning that can happen in a therapeutic space, though. It doesn't have to happen outside
before.
of, yes.
Okay,
Um,
good to hear.
yeah, and that is part of that those principles of those practices of that, like as a therapist, I am seeking to help somebody turn and embrace what it is that they're avoiding. And there's people are unbelievably sophisticated in their ability to deflect and avoid
Mhm.
and have the attention be all over here because what is that underlining fear or pain that they don't want, that they aren't getting in contact with. Um, and so also one of the questions that I would have, what I would be curious about with your son is like, where is he stuck? Where,
Yeah, it just it sort of never gets a break, and there's a lot of that deflection. And a la DBT, two things can be true. Maybe his partners in his small business are taking advantage of him. That could be true. Eh, or maybe they're not. But it's that's where he gets stuck, and I don't know. It's very just a very black and white thinker. In when your model of talking about flexibility, just inflexible from 2 years old. I mean, just that's been a challenge for him. And even though he's intelligent, as many of our loved ones are, he gets in his own way, by people getting in their own way. And the substance, of course, instead of, well, short term relieving the pain, obviously just complicated things and did not make him feel better about himself, made him
course.
feel worse. So, but I think if I had to say, I'd say he has severe anxiety and a fear of failure and all sorts of things. I mean, I would think he's had some wonderful therapists over the years. He's very particular. They have to get his sense of, it's very black and white thinker. So I'd say like 1 out of every 6 passes muster for a while. I can name the ones in New Haven. We live out on the shoreline. He's in the New Haven area, but he's
And how old is he?
he's 28. He's
Okay, yeah.
28. So
Yeah, and and that's also where some
yeah,
of the values-based work can be really helpful.
yeah,
This may all be true. And if, like, how do you want to show up, right? Not in relation to that person, but in relationship to you and the man you want to be. You know, what is meaningful in these moments of, maybe it's about growth or how you triumphed, or, is there a way in which you can access, yeah, value in tolerating those things, right?
It's that distress, and that also reminded of DBT, that um, being open to improving your ability to distress tolerance.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's hard. It's nobody wants to do it, but it's okay. And so it seems like might be something he might be.
Yeah, and they're all, by the way, they're all under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy,
Right.
right? So there's DBT and then there's ACT.
CBT and ACT.
Uh,
Does somebody have to be, what if I would say he is at the stage, it ebbs and flows, but I'd say he is still, in terms of his acceptance of substance abuse,
mhm,
he is still very much, he can control it. He just overdid because he was trying to kill himself,
mhm,
literally.
mhm,
So not accidentally, literally.
mhm.
And when he has had sobriety, it's been because there's legal issues. Uh, yeah. I mean,
Right.
and that's what he would say. That's how he would articulate it. And, I just try to validate the feelings and how hard that must be, and how we just hope for him that meaning and purpose in life, that everybody deserves that.
Mhm.
And I don't know that he believes better self-esteem would be nice. I don't know how you can do that as a
Yeah.
parent or a therapist. But I don't know. Do you make some headway with people who aren't committed to sobriety yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You do not need to be sober. Um, because again, we're talking about inflexibility, right? Like we also don't need to be rigid in that, like you have to be completely abstinence to benefit,
Yeah.
right? Like that in and of itself would be contrary to this concept of flexibility.
Right.
Um, the substance use would really to be looking at like, well, what function does it serve? Does it align with how you want to show up? Does it lead to a
Mhm.
meaningful life? Does it bring you closer or farther away? And what are you potentially losing by
That's
engaging in that substance? Because that's then also where you can maybe start figuring out what's the avoidance, what would come up if you didn't use the substance in that moment? How would that feel?
that's exactly. That makes complete sense to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sounds like, yeah, I mean, I also want to honor the fact that I can't imagine how challenging it's been to navigate the complexity of his situation and what that means also for like, with diagnoses, like what program, what's the best resource?
And bound support, yet
Mhm.
boundaries, all of those um, issues. And we've done a lot of trial and error, as has he. And right now, and there were periods when the relationship was very strained and rocky, and it's now, at least on the surface, very loving and close.
Wow.
But well, that's the good part. but and he's not well at the same. That's
And that's where it's like a continuum, right?
it's
Like that inflexibility, that's why it doesn't start and end.
it,
Right?
that's one thing I can tell people. And when I am in other support groups, um, I think that's a commonality, and that's very scary. If people have had a crisis and that's their first thing, or it's bubbled up to a head, and very much, I think, as parents anyway, my feeling is, people want to fix it, solve it, and well, what I've gotten, at least from DBT, is, and kind of what I wondered about your actions is, you can try some of those things, but the trick to me has been getting off that fix it, solve it
Yep.
train when it's not actually succeeding or making things better for anybody, and then moving on to more reframing or acceptance or circling
Mhm.
back,
Mhm. Yeah.
kind of thing. So I think I would get something out of it. I don't know. I find all these modalities helpful for me, just to have them in my,
Of
it's
course.
cliche to say toolkit, but I do think it's very helpful to have.
Of course. Of course.
So
Meredith, did you have a question?
Hi. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
Hi. I really appreciated, all that. I was actually writing notes while you were talking, and I'm just wondering about ACT and the person with like in early recovery who is often talking about like it's the anxiety, right? I have so much
Mhm.
anxiety, and Susan brought it up, and I really like I'm sort of like I actually took a picture of my cat has never been so interested in me than he has
Your
like
cat's
last
wonderful.
hour. I'm wondering like how you would sort of start the conversation with someone in early recovery around the intolerance of the anxiety, right? The feeling, the um, obviously, withdrawal creates anxiety. I understand that. But sort of moving in throughout the time where it just seems like, I'm always looking for m more tools on how to talk about anxiety. Now, were you sort of talking about it's the just the acceptance of it? Is it that simple, or am I?
Well, so that's where sometimes like the acceptance of anxiety it almost conveys this understanding of, okay, bye, Jason. Um, there's like, oh, so I just need to like be anxious. Um, and what's happening there is the person is still extremely fused with that anxiety.
Mhm.
And so it can feel really stifling when you're like, you just have to accept the anxiety. And so part of the work is really trying to separate the individual from that anxiety and being able to observe and notice the anxiety. Um, and then also noticing like what thoughts that anxiety bring up, right? So I'm curious, is it like that they're saying, oh, like I have to use to get rid of this anxiety?
Mm. I don't, I don't even know if it's even that. I think that nobody knows better than you when you're
Hmm.
someone's, and I know we only have a little bit of time, but it's not that I have to, they are not saying I have to use because I have this anxiety. It's that this anxiety in this moment is intolerable, right? And so I'm just wondering, and I can look
Right.
more into this, but like what in like I'm sort of like looking for in those moments how this can be helpful to that person to maybe be more observant of the anxiety, I guess is what you're saying, and less like I can't live with it. I can't,
Mhm.
I've got to go to nursing to go get a Clonidine, and when is the next time I can get to nursing for a Clonidine? I'm more thinking about that, like how can I help that person in that moment? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Right. And so that's where I would use you can use any of the six processes,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And that's also the point is you sort of want to poke and see which one is there going to be movement.
Hmm.
Maybe it's this present moment awareness. Maybe it's meditation. Maybe it's grounding techniques, right? More
Hmm.
just how do we get more in the here and now,
Hmm.
return to safety. It sounds like there's a lot of like cognitive fusion. There's a lot of thoughts that come up from this anxiety. How do we start like observing those thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh, look, my anxiety is creating this thought. How do I create a
Mhm.
little bit of space between the thought and this like observing self? Um, what would it be to just notice that you have this anxiety and create space? That's the acceptance, right? And create
Right.
space for this anxiety. What would be valuable about being willing to go through that discomfort? How does this align with
Hmm.
how you want to be, right? What can you ground yourself in with the values why that will like help you just expand into this experience?
Right.
How can I also self as context, take a step
Mhm.
out and recognize that this anxiety that I feel is just a small moment in time. And
Mm.
moments that I haven't felt this anxiety, this isn't all that I feel, this isn't all that it's going to be, right? Let's think about all the other areas of like who I am and how I have been in life to pull
Mhm.
upon. And then committed action. What's one thing that I can do right now that aligns with all of that? Maybe
Okay.
it's like just delay how when I go get that clonidine. Maybe it's,
Yeah.
so that's where I would sort of use and be mindful of all of the tools available.
Yeah. This is really helpful. I mean, I've heard you talk a little bit about it in the past and just like you just um new ways of in like yeah, evidence-based ways of talking about these things are, it's just also helpful.
Mhm. Well, I do think ACT is yeah, very helpful.
Okay.
So you said this is the third wave. What are the other two waves of CBT?
Uh, that would be CBT. There's also like, this is going into sort of the origins of all behavioral uh, applications. So there's also like relational RFT.
And then DBT, you mentioned DBT as well.
DBT is part of like, I guess you would say second wave with CBT. And then ACT is with this wave of like for example, another third wave CBT intervention would be compassion focused therapy.
Mm.
Um, so it's sort of this movement towards self-compassion,
Mhm.
self-embrace movement that some of these CBT offshoots have been going in.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Well, I think this was outstanding. And for the people that had missed this great conversation, I have recorded it.